The town of Cedar Hill sat tucked away in Texas, surrounded by quiet streets, wide lawns, and houses that all seemed to look the same. On the surface, it was the kind of place where families felt safe, leaving their doors unlocked. Children played freely until the sun went down, and everyone knew who lived next door. Life there gave the impression of calm predictability, a small world where nothing unusual or dangerous could ever happen. People trusted appearances, believing that the neat gardens and polite smiles reflected the truth about the neighborhood. But behind those well-kept fences and friendly greetings, darker realities were waiting to reveal themselves. At the center of this seemingly perfect community was Officer Mark Turner. To most, he was the kind of man people wanted on their side. He wore his uniform with pride, attended church on Sundays, and made small talk with neighbors in the driveway. His presence carried weight, not only because of his job, but because of the authority he projected everywhere he went. He was tall, firm in his movements, and always carried himself as if he were the one in control. The townspeople often spoke of him with respect, saying how lucky Cedar Hill was to have such a strong figure keeping watch. Yet, those who looked closely could sense something colder beneath his polite nods and forced smiles. Mark lived with his wife, Linda, in a modest brick home near the edge of the suburb. From the outside, their marriage seemed steady. They shared weekend barbecues, hosted small gatherings, and gave off the impression of a couple who had built a comfortable life. But inside their walls, the silence was heavy. Mark's temper simmered just below the surface, and Linda often found herself walking carefully, trying not to spark it. The officer who appeared honorable in public was far more complicated at home. Across the street, a new presence was settling in. Alisha Green, a young woman of 22, had recently moved into the neighborhood after finishing college. She rented a small house on her own, quiet and neat, with a porch light that gave off a soft glow at night. Alisha carried herself with independence, not relying on anyone to help her navigate her new life. To the casual observer, she was simply another young adult starting out, someone who would eventually blend into the rhythm of the community. But to Mark, her arrival stood out immediately. From the first moment he saw her unloading boxes from a moving truck, Mark noticed her. She was different from the families who had long filled the neighborhood. In his mind, she represented something both unfamiliar and unsettling. Instead of ignoring her presence, he found his eyes drawn to her house each time he stepped outside. The sight of her walking down the street, carrying groceries, or watering her small garden became a quiet distraction from his rigid routine. To the rest of the town, the new neighbor was nothing more than a polite young woman starting fresh. But to Mark, her presence was the spark that would eventually unravel the illusion of Cedar Hill's safety. The town did not yet know it, but the peace they took for granted was already beginning to fracture. What seemed like an ordinary summer in a quiet suburb was the beginning of a story that would end in tragedy. Mark's attention toward Alisha began with simple observations, the kind of things a neighbor might notice without meaning to. He saw, when she left for work in the morning, when she returned in the evenings, and how she kept to herself instead of mingling with the other residents. At first, he convinced himself it was nothing more than harmless curiosity. But as the days turned into weeks, his interest grew into something heavier, something he could not push aside. He found reasons to linger outside when she was near, adjusting the lawn sprinkler or pretending to check the mail just to catch sight of her. Each glance fed a quiet obsession he refused to admit even to himself. The uniform he wore gave him confidence, but it also gave him a dangerous sense of entitlement. He believed that his badge placed him above the rules everyone else lived by. When he looked at Alisha, it wasn't with the respect he showed in public, but with the eyes of a man who thought he had the power to take whatever he wanted. His prejudices made the attraction twisted. Deep inside, he carried resentment toward people like her, but that same resentment drove his fixation. To him, being close to her was not about affection, but about control, a way to prove his dominance. The first steps into their secret connection came through small, seemingly innocent encounters. Mark would stop by her driveway after finishing a night shift, making light conversation under the excuse of checking on his new neighbor's safety. At first, Alisha saw nothing unusual about it, Living alone in a quiet suburb, she thought it was reassuring to have a police officer across the street looking out for her. His presence seemed protective, even comforting, but Mark's intentions stretched far beyond neighborly kindness. Over time, his visits became more frequent. What started as casual check-ins turned into long moments spent inside her house, where no one else could see. The secrecy of their interactions gave Mark a thrill, while Alisha, still young and new, to living on her own, found excitement in the attention of someone older and authoritative. She believed she was stepping into something thrilling, not realizing the dangerous imbalance hidden beneath. Mark knew he was crossing a line with every step, yet the risk only drew him in further. He convinced himself that nobody would ever suspect a respected officer of having an affair with the girl across the street. The uniform shielded him from suspicion, and his wife's trust gave him cover. But even as the affair deepened, his bitterness never faded. He could not escape his ingrained hatred, and it crept into the way he treated Alisha. His affection was poisoned by resentment, his attraction laced with scorn. What began as a secret thrill was already shifting into something darker. For Alisha, the relationship felt like a daring adventure, but she underestimated the weight of the storm gathering around her. For Mark, it was never about love. It was about possession, and with each passing day, his need for control tightened like a noose, setting the stage for the destruction to come. The early secrecy that surrounded Mark and Alisha's affair could not last forever. For a time, he managed to maintain the appearance of control, balancing his marriage, his reputation, and the hidden relationship across the street. But cracks began to show. The man who once prided himself on discipline grew careless. He lingered too long at Alisha's home, parked his patrol car where neighbors could see it, and carried himself with a restless edge that people around him started to notice. Inside Alisha's home, the change was even clearer. At first, Mark had been attentive, even charming in his own rough way. But as the weeks passed, the darkness within him began to emerge. His words grew sharper, his moods more unpredictable. He would show up unannounced, sometimes in uniform, demanding her attention without regard for her own plans. When she tried to set boundaries, his anger surfaced quickly, a reminder that his attraction was never free of hostility. His racism, which he once disguised beneath forced politeness, started to spill out in cruel remarks and cold stares. Alisha sensed the shift and began to feel uneasy, though she underestimated just how dangerous Mark could be. She told herself he was stressed from work, that his temper was part of his personality, and that she could manage it. In truth, the imbalance of power between them was growing impossible to ignore. He was a man with authority, armed both by his position and by the secrets he held over her. What once felt like a risky adventure was slowly turning into a cage. Meanwhile, Linda Turner, Mark's wife, started noticing changes in her husband's behavior. He was distracted at home, often leaving without explanation, and his temper flared more easily than before. At night, she would wake to find him missing, the patrol car gone long after his shifts were supposed to end. Suspicion grew quietly in her mind, but she lacked proof. She wanted to believe her marriage was still intact, that Mark was the man he presented to the world. Yet the unease lingered, gnawing at her with each passing day. The neighborhood itself began to whisper. Cedar Hill was small, and people paid attention to small details. Residents noticed how often the officer's car was parked near Alisha's house, sometimes late into the night. Others remarked on how the young woman seemed more withdrawn, less cheerful than when she first arrived. Though no one dared confront Mark directly, conversations began to circulate behind closed doors, creating an air of unease around the once peaceful street. Mark felt the pressure building. His double life was harder to maintain, and his bitterness deepened. He despised the thought of being exposed, yet he could not stay away from Alisha. Each encounter became more volatile, a clash of desire and hatred that left the walls of her home echoing with tension. He was caught in a trap of his own making, torn between protecting his image and feeding the obsession that consumed him. By then, the mask he wore for years was slipping. To the outside world, he still appeared as the decorated officer, the proud husband, the man who embodied authority. But beneath that mask, His obsession had transformed into something violent. The quiet suburb that once seemed untouched by scandal was inching toward a revelation, and the truth about Mark Turner was beginning to surface. The illusion of Cedar Hill's safety was unraveling, one crack at a time. The sweltering heat of a Texas summer weighed heavily on Cedar Hill the night everything unraveled. For weeks, the tension around Mark Turner had been building, his secret life teetering on the edge of collapse. Linda had grown increasingly suspicious of her husband's absences, her unease finally transforming into action. One evening, while he was in the shower, she checked his phone. What she found shattered any remaining trust: messages, photos, and call logs that linked him directly to Alisha. The officer she had defended for years, the man she thought she knew, had been lying all along. The confrontation erupted almost immediately. When Linda demanded an explanation, Mark's carefully constructed mask crumbled. Panic coursed through him, not because he felt guilt, but because he realized how close he was to losing everything. His wife's knowledge threatened his marriage, his career, and the respect he commanded in the community. For a man whose identity was built on power and control, the thought of public humiliation was unbearable. His anger erupted in a storm of rage, words spilling out like venom. Linda, terrified, realized she had touched a dangerous nerve, one that could no longer be ignored. Unable to face exposure, Mark turned his fury toward the root of his downfall: Alisha. In his mind, she became the symbol of everything he hated, the reason his carefully ordered life was slipping through his fingers. That night, under the heavy cloak of darkness, he crossed the street to her home. Neighbors later recalled hearing the faint slam of a door, followed by muffled shouting. The sounds carried through the summer air, disturbing the quiet that Cedar Hill residents were so used to. Some thought it was a simple argument and dismissed it. Others admitted they felt uneasy, but didn't want to interfere. Inside Alisha's home, the situation spiraled into chaos. Mark's rage, fueled by fear of exposure and poisoned by his deep-seated prejudice, erupted violently. The man who once appeared protective and strong revealed his true nature: cruel, unrestrained, and dangerous. Alisha, caught off guard, had little chance to defend herself. What followed was a brutal outburst that left her fighting for her life. By dawn, the quiet house across the street told a different story. Alisha's lifeless body was discovered, the scene hastily staged to resemble a break-in. Drawers had been pulled open, items scattered, but nothing of value was missing. It was a sloppy attempt to cover the truth, and anyone who looked closely could see the flaws. The violence was too personal, the details too deliberate. It was not the work of a stranger, but of someone who knew her, someone whose anger had left a clear and undeniable mark. When word of the discovery spread, shock rippled through the community. Cedar Hill, the place that once prided itself on safety, was now the site of a tragedy that could not be ignored. Whispers of Mark's patrol car parked near Alisha's home, of the shouting heard the night before, and of Linda's growing suspicion began to merge into a damning narrative. The facade that Mark had built over years was collapsing in the most public way possible. What had begun as a secret affair ended in bloodshed, and the illusion of Cedar Hill's peace was shattered beyond repair. The events of that night marked the breaking point, the moment when Mark's carefully guarded double life was exposed in the most violent way imaginable. It was the point of no return, the night when obsession and hatred fused into a crime that would haunt the neighborhood forever. The investigation into Alisha Green's death began immediately, and it did not take long for suspicions to point toward Mark Turner. At first, the townspeople struggled to believe that their trusted officer could be involved in something so horrific. For years, he had stood as a figure of authority, the man called upon in moments of crisis. Yet as detectives began to piece together the evidence, the image of the decorated officer started to crumble. The burglary scene looked staged, almost careless, and the violence inflicted on Alisha told investigators it was deeply personal. This was not the work of a stranger passing through. It was someone close, someone whose emotions had driven the act. Phone records were the first crack in Mark's defense. Late-night calls, frequent messages, and location data showed a pattern that could not be ignored. His presence at Alisha's home was undeniable. Surveillance cameras from nearby streets captured his patrol car parked outside her house on nights when neighbors had overheard arguments. The thin wall of secrecy he relied on had collapsed, leaving behind a trail that pointed straight at him. Linda Turner became a key witness in the unraveling of her husband's life. With trembling hands, she handed over the evidence she had discovered, the messages and photos that tied Mark directly to Alisha. Her testimony painted the picture of a man consumed by anger, unable to balance the double life he had created. For Linda, the betrayal cut deeply, but her decision to speak out gave investigators the leverage they needed. What had been whispered suspicions was now documented proof. The arrest shocked Cedar Hill. To see a man once trusted in uniform led away in handcuffs shook the town's sense of security to its core. The neighbors who once waved at him from across their lawns now stared in disbelief, realizing that the predator they feared had lived among them in plain sight. The trial that followed became a national spectacle, exposing not only the affair but also the dangerous mix of racism, obsession, and abuse of power that fueled the crime. Inside the courtroom, every detail was laid bare. Prosecutors described how Mark's hatred and fear of exposure had pushed him to murder. The staged burglary was revealed for what it was, a desperate attempt to hide the truth. Witness after witness confirmed his pattern of obsession, his presence at Alisha's home, and his growing volatility in the weeks leading up to the crime. The once proud officer sat silently, his reputation stripped away, his authority reduced to nothing more than a memory. The verdict was swift and unforgiving. Mark Turner was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that matched the gravity of the crime. The man who once embodied power and control was now confined to a cell, left with nothing but the echoes of his downfall. Linda filed for divorce soon after, severing the last tie to the life they once shared. For Cedar Hill, the scars ran deep. The quiet neighborhood that once felt untouchable could no longer claim innocence. The tragedy of Alisha's death served as a reminder that evil can hide behind polished smiles and respected uniforms. Her story became a symbol of how prejudice, when left unchecked, can transform into violence with devastating consequences. The town would never return to what it once was. Behind every manicured lawn and every polite greeting lingered the memory of how a secret affair ended in blood, betrayal, and the destruction of a community's trust. By then, the mask he wore for years was slipping. To the outside world, he still appeared as the decorated officer, the proud husband, the man who embodied authority. But beneath that mask, his obsession had transformed into something violent. The quiet suburb that once seemed untouched by scandal was inching toward a revelation, and the truth about Mark Turner was beginning to surface. The illusion of Cedar Hill's safety was unraveling, one crack at a time.